A group of anti-ICE protesters receiving dramatic sentences in connection to a Prairieland Detention Center protest in Texas last year. That demonstration ended up turning violent and chaotic, and an officer was shot in the shoulder by a Marine Corps reservist who had no prior criminal history. Prosecutors say that protester pulled the trigger. Their attorney says, though, they were just trying to fire a warning shot. He was sentenced to 100 years in prison. Of the 7 others already sentenced, they are facing 30 to 70 years in prison for their roles in this protest, some of whom were not even present at it or left the scene well before that shot was fired. Even so, they've been labeled by prosecutors as being part of a North Texas Antifa cell. They were charged, in some cases, for printing left-wing zines, literature, and being connected to a leftist book club. Let's bring in Nnamdi Egwuonwu live from Fort Worth, Texas, and former prosecutor and civil rights attorney Charles Coleman. He's also, of course, an MS Now political analyst. Nnamdi, I'll start with you there on the ground in Texas. What more do we know about the group set to be sentenced today?
Yeah, Antonia, the bulk of the sentencings today concerned people who actually took plea deals. They pled guilty earlier in December, some of whom served as cooperating witnesses. But one of the sentences today concerned Inez Soto, who went to trial. His wife, Elizabeth Soto, alongside friend Savannah Batten, were sentenced to 50 years in prison last week, despite the fact that their attorneys say they didn't have any firearms, they didn't shoot any fireworks at that demonstration, which I'll remind you took place last year on the 4th of July. They arrived after Benjamin Song and some of those more intimately involved in the planning. And most importantly, they say they left when instructed to by correctional staff. Despite that, though, Elizabeth Soto, Savannah Batten, and today Inez Soto were sentenced to 50 years in prison. Antonio, if I may, I want to spotlight one other case we heard today. It concerned Rebecca Morgan. That's an individual who actually not only wasn't at the detention facility, she wasn't in the county the night of that demonstration. Her crime was in the aftermath of that. Benjamin Song went to her home and she allowed him in. That was the crime. She was charged with material support to a terrorist and today was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Her mother revealed today in court that earlier this month she actually suffered a heart attack. She's 24 years old and she nearly lost her life. She had to be brought back to life via defibrillator at 24. Despite explaining that to the judge, she still was sentenced to 50 years in prison, though the judge did say she should be placed in a facility that will accommodate her health concerns.
Nnamdi, you had the chance to speak with a loved one, a family member connected to this case. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Sure. We spoke to the sister of Savannah Batten. You kind of laid it out earlier. She was someone who didn't have any firearms, didn't have any fireworks, left when told to. But the crime was she was accused by the prosecution of having zines, left-wing zines that they said supported this idea of insurrectionist behavior. She was sentenced to 50 years in prison. And I spoke to her sister yesterday about how her family is navigating all of this, how she feels. And what she laid out to me is that the real struggle for her is the government's characterization of her sister. Her sister, who she said is an empath, values humanity, but according to the government is an extremist, is a terrorist sympathizer, and is a violent radical. I want to play you a portion of our conversation.
You know, in the retelling that the government has given of the story, she's not a terrorist. She's not an evil person. In fact, I've met hundreds of people just over the course of this case unrolling. I've met hundreds of people who have either met or personally know and maintain relationships with my sister, and you can't find anyone to say a negative thing about her. Her entire life, so much has been accused of anything violent. She's never gotten into a physical fight. She's never hit anyone. Again, she won't even say a swear word.
That is a common thread we heard from several family members who spoke today in court, that the descriptions of their loved ones presented by the government just aren't accurate. And if anything, their attendance of that demonstration showcases their compassion and their aim to at least show support for some of the immigrants that were detained in that facility that night.
Charles, you're a former prosecutor.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard anything of this? I'm just really struck by Nnamdi sharing the story of that woman, Rebecca Morgan, not even in the county on the day, at the time that this protest takes place. But because one of the protesters came into her home, she gets 15 years in prison?
Certainly, this seems like an excessive abuse of prosecutorial discretion. And that's what I would argue from the gate if I were the defense attorney in this matter. I'm curious about the judge here, Antonia, because the judge that's handing down these sentences they are making decisions in part that are influenced by the designation of Antifa and the association of the defendants in this case with a terrorist organization. And
something
the charges,
done by the Trump administration.
Yes, correct. And the charges then exactly, they trigger a higher level of sentencing, which is where we're getting these numbers from. But to your point, in that example, that is something where, as a prosecutor, you would look at and say, once you have the facts, why are we going forward with this case? So certainly there seems like an agenda that's being pushed. But I want to sort of like broaden the scope here and look at the idea of this case, or these cases rather, through the lens of the First Amendment. When you're talking about January 6th, and the protesters there and the sentences that they got, which were ultimately, sort of, they weren't exonerated, but they were pardoned by the president. And then you look at the protesters here. They were both exercising First Amendment rights to freedom of protest, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And one was doing so much more violently than someone who, like you just pointed out, wasn't even in the county at the same time. So how do we get this disparate result?
Yeah, I mean, to your point on January 6th, the judge here at one point, this is U.S. District Judge Reed O'Connor, called this protest an assault on democracy. And given what we've seen happen with January 6th and this administration's role in trying to erase that history and the reality of what Americans saw with their own eyes that day, that phrasing in particular just really caught my eye.
I mean, you're talking about a group of individuals who assaulted the United States Capitol, who injured and assaulted and ultimately resulted in the death of Capitol police officers. And now you're talking about, and I'm not trying to diminish and parse out law enforcement in one end versus the other. But what I'm saying to you is you had people who were there, who were exercising their right to protest. You had someone who was injured, who was shot. But again, the sentencing disparity is completely out of whack. And I don't understand how you, with a straight face, can call that an assault on democracy and completely ignore what we talked about on January 6th.
I have like 5 seconds left, Charles, sure. But if you are one of these people, one of these protesters in Texas, do you have an option to get these reduced, overturned in some way? What would you do?
I'm hopeful for appeals on a lot of these sentences, especially the ones like the case we just discussed. I don't know how successful they'll be, but I do imagine some of the sentences will come down on appeal.
All right. Nnamdi Egwuonwu and Charles Coleman, thank you guys. Good to see you.